it is a pivotal property to the history of Pittsford for many different reasons. So what I first want to give you is a little context of what the village was like before this house was built. And some of you have heard some of this from me before, but when the settlers, European American settlers, arrived in Pittsford, almost all of them came from eastern New York State, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont. Almost all of our settlers came from those areas. A lot of them had money because they bought large parcels of land. The other thing that's quite surprising is how many professionals moved to Pittsford. By the first decade of the 19th century, we had doctors, attorneys, accountants here in Pittsford. And there's many reasons for that. One was that Pittsford originally was all of eastern Monroe County, and what became the nucleus of our community today was the first really hamlet that was settled in Monroe County. And originally it was at the milepost where the first cemetery and the first school were located. But in 1805, when the state built Monroe Avenue, which was called the State Road to encourage settlement here, everything migrated down this way. The first version of the Phoenix Hotel was built in 1806. There was a little green in front of it that survived until the 1920s. And if you walk carefully around, you have to get out of your car really to see this, but if you walk around the village and you look carefully at the oldest houses, and many houses have changed. In many cases, the back wing or the side wing of the house was the original house, and they just kept adding on through the 19th century as the family grew. But the way the village was originally laid out, it really has the form of a New England village, with long, narrow lots, houses that most of the not grand houses, but the normal houses were very close to the street. You can still see some of these on North Main Street, some on State Street, Church Street, South Street. There's examples of where you can see this. In the 19th century, the reason for the settlement pattern was that most families had some, they might have had chickens or hogs, horses, and they had gardens, and many of them had orchards. In fact, the Ira Buck's house, the 1826 house next door, had a large orchard behind it. And up until the 1850s, when this house was built, really it was, Pittsford had, there was Main Street, and then there was State Street going east to the canal, and Church Street and South Street, and that was it. It really was just a hamlet with federal and very small, modest Greek Revival houses. This house was a radical departure, and I'll come back to that later on, and I'll explain why that was. Now, for Dr. Hartwell Carver, who built this house, he was born in 1789, the same year Simon and Israel Stone came to Pittsford. He was born in Rhode Island, and his family, who were farmers, moved to Otsego, New York, near Cooperstown, where he worked on the family farm, then as a farmhand. He attended Hamilton College and then transferred to Harvard and graduated from Harvard Medical School, I think in 1813, if I have that right, 1813 or 1819, anyway, something like that. A short time after that, he came to Pittsford and established a medical practice here. He also had an office in Rochester where he practiced medicine. He also started several general merchandise retail stores, one in Rochester, one in Buffalo, and one in Lockport. So he was a man of many interests. Even as a young man, he traveled to Europe. He was never married, and he had several other trips to Europe. On one of those trips, he admired the British rail system, and he had seen that also the early rail systems in the United States running between New York City and Philadelphia, and had the idea of, we should have a transcontinental railroad. So as early as 1831, he began writing these treatises on the reasons why the United States should invest in a transcontinental railroad. He appeared before Congress several times. And for some reason, this was a passion of his life. And he had a bigger-than-life persona. And, he was very proud that in 1862 he curtailed his efforts because that's when the Union decided to actually build the Transcontinental Railroad. And when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific had the Golden Spike ceremony in Provo, Utah, he attended there. And there's a photograph, I think it's in the Library of Congress, was Dr. Hartwell Carver. You can see him at the ceremony. He lived until 1875, largely retired in his later years, but always bragged about being the father of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the academics have somewhat dispute this because there were other advocates for a Transcontinental Railroad, and there's been a couple poorly researched articles in the D&C that think he was full of hot air. We don't really know. In Mount Hope Cemetery, excuse me, a year ago when I did a Facebook post on Mount Hope Cemetery, I actually found his grave, and it's the tallest grave in Mount Hope Cemetery. It's a huge pylon. It's 57 feet tall that supposedly was paid for by the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Now, some people dispute that and say he paid for it for himself, but it has, it's inscribed with Father of the Transcontinental Railroad, and it's not just a monument with there's a statue of a woman with a book on top of it, 57 feet in the air. Then it has these granite pylons that go around it and are linked with chains. So it's a real monument. If you go to Mount Hope Cemetery, it's one of the monuments that will really catch your eye. Now, the reason the house was a departure is because until this time, and in Western New York, the architectural styles of the 19th century, if you were a rural town like Pittsford, you usually got the style about 10 years later than it was introduced in New York City. And so, whereas Greek Revival first appeared around 1820 in, say, Boston or, Philadelphia, here in Western New York, it's really 1835 is when we started to see it. It wasn't until 1840 that Greek Revival replaced Federal. And they were still, some places they were still building that type of construction into the 1840s. In any case, everything was white. A lot of them had green shutters. And that's what everything in the village looked like until this house was built. And in the mid-19th century, there was a wave of philosophical designers that included A.J. Downing, A.J. Davis, and Calvert Vaux, Calvert Vaux worked with Olmsted to design Central Park, that tried to espouse a new philosophy of design in America. And whereas Greek Revival had become popular because in the 1820s, Greece was fighting for independence from Turkey, and people felt that the style represented the ideals of American democracy, whereas Federal architecture was based on the work of British architect Robert Adam, so that was rejected in favor of Greek Revival. What Downing and his group said is that America is different from Europe, and we need an architecture that fits the rural, agrarian landscape and natural features that we have. So instead of, white classical boxes, we need things that fit into the landscape and blend. And so there was a new palette of colors that was introduced of grays and sands and browns and greens, and a variety of romantic styles that included Gothic Revival like this house, Italianate, Egyptian, Swiss chalet was another one, and there were different permutations of those. Italian villa was another popular style that was based on the farmhouses around Florence and Tuscany. But this was really the first building of that vintage that was built in Pittsford. And for some reason, Gothic Revival is not particularly common in Western New York. And in Pittsford, there were only 3 Gothic houses that I know of. One is on South Main Street. It's more Carpenter Gothic. And there was a house, the Lem Lusk House on North Main Street, but in the 70s they vinyl sided it and stripped away the Gothic details, so not much is left of that. This was a real departure because it had a radically different design. You can see, if you look at the original photograph, which they had out on the table earlier, it looked quite different than it did today, but the overall partie was the same. It was based on popular, published A.J. Downing published a book, Country Houses, that was circulated throughout the nation, and people all over the country copied those designs or did things very close to them. You can certainly, if you look at this house, you can see a very close correlation to that. And this is actually a brick house. The brick is covered with board and battens. Board and battens was a popular, because in America everybody built out of wood, but they were trying to replicate the appearance of British stone construction, and they wanted verticality. So the windows, these windows are, you can see they have a very vertical proportion on the outside. The roofs, if you look at the house next door, the roof is like that. This house is like this, like a church. There's pointed arch windows in all of the gables. The barge boards are those decorative trim pieces underneath the eaves, and then there's finials on the gable and underneath the gable. Those are all distinctive qualities of Gothic revival. And after this house was built, now the Gothic revival, the key periods for that were the 1850s through the 1860s, and then it kind of morphed into something called High Victorian Gothic, which is something different that we won't get into today. So there's only one of them in Pittsford. But after this house was built, then the predominant style switched. The next popular style, that was kind of like fashion fads in the 19th century, was Italianate. And there were a ton of Italianate houses built all over Pittsford, which you can see throughout the town and in the village. The best example would be my parents' house at 44 North Main Street. A lot of older houses, and that house was a federal house that was completely updated into the Italianate style. And even the Phoenix Hotel, which is, a seminal example of federal architecture, at one point it had a porch that looks just like the porch at 44 North Main Street with brackets on it, and they even had brackets under the eaves. I think there's maybe 2 brackets left on that. And that was very common. So that this house really represented that change in architectural style. Now, after Hartwell Carver died, there were several other owners, and then in the 1920s, this house had a fire. I forgot the date. It was maybe, Caro, do you remember the date of the fire?
I think it was 1920.
1920, yeah.
1920.
Yeah. So it was a fairly significant fire. So the house was completely renovated after that, and that's, this big bay window didn't exist. Probably there were 2 windows, and they added that to make this fireplace is one of the features. The whole floor plan, the staircase, this is all an early 20th century interior on the house. The only thing
This was 2 rooms.
Yeah, it would have been a double parlor originally. And this is, I wanted to point out the trim on the windows. That's shouldered trim. And that's kind of transitional between Greek revival and Gothic revival, and probably because they used local carpenters, they weren't looking at a pattern book. But that's original to the house. But what I wanted to say, and also on the table they had the landscape plan that was done during the 1920s, and after 1902, when the trolley came here, that really made the village a suburb of Rochester, because you could get to downtown Rochester in 20 minutes easily or less on the trolley. And by 1910, many people had cars. And then from that point onward, it was really easy just to drive into Rochester. And Sutherland Street, the whole north side of the village were built and ran place because Pittsford became commutable. At the same time, there was a whole wave of kind of quasi-country estates. A lot of people in Rochester wanted to live in Pittsford because it was beautiful, it was away from the city, it had, kind of that same bucolic character, some of which is left today. And so there were a number of houses that were built, large houses, like the Whiting House up on Jefferson Road, and I can point to numerous ones in the town.
Which house is that?
That is the one, if you're on Jefferson Road and you're going west out of the village, you pass Heatherhurst. There's a 1960s house, and then there's a Italian Renaissance style house. That's the one.
The baseball field.
across from the baseball field, and the Whitings had the Buick dealership, which was one of the prime dealerships in Rochester. It was right on East Avenue near Alexander Street. In any case, the renovation of this house was part of that wave. The Sutherland house across the street, and I should mention that Vicki Prophet she was going to give a talk on the Sutherland House on Tuesday to the seniors at the Spiegel Center, but she's going to delay that, but she's researching the Sutherland House. That house, Isaac Sutherland, all of this was part of the Sutherland farm. In fact, Hartwell Carver bought this lot from Isaac Sutherland, and the whole west side of the village was the Sutherland farm. He died, I think it was 1898 or 1899, just before the turn of the century, and then all this land became available, and that's why most of the development on this side of the village is right after 1900. But that house was a federal house and was renovated about the same time as this, and apparently it was done by a flipper or something, because it was renovated and then sold like a year later. But the stucco on the outside, the wing and everything, is essentially the same style inside as this house is, and it was part of that wave, and really it was the first wave of real suburban development that happened in the village. And then I guess the last important thing I would say in the chapter of this house is in the 1960s, when Historic Pittsford was founded, and there was a new awareness that unless we do things differently in Pittsford, Pittsford would just devolve into the anonymous suburbs that we see everywhere else, because there were some pretty awful things that happened, and a lot of buildings were torn down in the 60s. As I've mentioned before, when the Phoenix Hotel had a fire in 1959, there was some discussion, maybe we should tear it down and we'll have more parking for the business district. Anyway, thanks to Andy Wolf, and there was another, Robert Wolf, and do you remember Robert Wolf's? Marianne Wolf, who lived in this house. They were with the Webbers, Bill and Jackie Webber, who lived next door, and Stuart and Nancy Bolger, who lived across the street, Adele Wynn and Dr. Wynn, who lived over there. There was kind of this coalition of core people of historic Pittsford who led the way to start, sort of the preservation ethos that people like Peggy and all of you have continued on to the present day, but this house was an important part of that as well. So that's my summary of history of the Hartwell Carver House. Thank you. And can I get everybody to stay in place for a second, because I want to take a picture of you all, because this is just a great picture. Yeah, ask me anything.
Where are you going?
I'm going to go to the corner so I can fit everybody in the picture. I don't want to discriminate. Oh, let's see. I can't see Carl.
I know, she's the teacher.
Would you mind doing the honors and just try it with wide angle? And thank you, Maria. Hey, Bill. Yes, that would be great. Any questions on anything or related to Pittsford? Or I can talk about the Pittsford Village Arboretum, which is a great project. No questions?
You
Yes.
mentioned A.J. Downing and his book, The Architecture of Country Houses in the middle 1840s, argued against white as a color for houses.
Correct.
Because it was not natural. And is it possible that this house was not originally white?
It's not clear what color this was originally. I know.
It was brick originally.
Well, no, it was built a brick, but the brick was as soon as it was built, it was covered with batten.
Oh, really?
It was intended to be.
That was the style of the drawings that you would see the batten.
Yeah, this is the original picture, and
This is a Bishop family who viewed this as a summer house. They lived on Fitzhugh Street in the city in the winter, and this is their summer house.
There's another A.J. Down house in Massillon that's kind of hidden in a way.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
That's underground. What became an underground railroad station, which is kind of ironic. You got an underground railroad compared with transcontinental railroad.
When the McBrides lived here, we did a scraping on the shutters, and we saw that the original color of the shutters appears to be like an olive green. We never did one on the siding, but it would be interesting to try to do that and figure out what it was. I'm not sure. That was the philosophy of Downing, was to not use white, but people did use white, and so I don't want to say. I know when the Wolfs lived here, they consulted with a former Historic Pittsford board member, Gene France, and they did a period color scheme, which was sand. There were two shades of sand, a darker one on the shutters and the trim, and one on the body, and then the sash of the windows was painted kind of like a Tuscan red, sort of like this red, only with a little bit more darker and a little more orange in it. And that was a very authentic color for the period. If you look at my house at 7 Washington Avenue, my house was built in 1840. Originally it was a Methodist parsonage. It was up by the Spiegel Center, and then they moved it down there when they cut Lincoln Avenue in there. But I chose kind of that palette of color. So I have green shutters and sand trim, and the trim is cream, and I have the dark red sash. But we could probably figure that out. It'd be interesting to know. Yeah.
The A.J. Downing architecture, that was based on, a lot of his drawings, he was a horticulturalist, wasn't he?
Yeah, I believe that is correct.
John Jacob Thomas, who was the next door neighbor of the place in Macedon, he was also another horticulturalist. That he had magazines that when he didn't have the internet, you went to these magazines that had ideas that he got from a whole lot of farmers and things like that, and he'd write up and have his.
And people copied him decade after decade. So from that period on to the end of the 19th century, then there were real pattern books that actually had plans and elevations, and then East Lake and Colonial Revival, and that continued on into the 20th century. The other thing that's interesting about what A.J. Downing did is that all the styles that he was recommending were European revival styles, and Gothic revival had been introduced in Britain in 1824, I think. There was a building built called Strawberry Castle, which was a fake Gothic castle, which was really the first Gothic revival. So even though they espoused an American style, basically the same thing in the Romantic period in Germany and France and in Britain was all happening at the same time, using very similar palettes of architectural style. And I guess that's just the nature of the world, and the same thing is happening today.
Downing was considered the father of American landscape architecture,
yep.
And he did publish his concepts in magazine Horticulture, published in Rochester, and even in the American Phrenological Journal, of all places. And I wondered, was there influence by those publications to this house?
Well, we don't know what the architecture was of that style, of that time. However, one of the big factors in Rochester that made there was more of an emphasis on landscape in Rochester than probably most other comparable cities because of the Ellwanger and Berry Nursery. And not only was that a nationally renowned brand that shipped nursery products throughout the nation, and is still the reason why we have Highland Park and Mount Hope Cemetery the way they are, they actually hired A.J. Davis, the gatehouse on Mount Hope Avenue, which is now owned by the University of Rochester, and the President's House. It was designed by another architect of that period, Gervase Wheeler, and they're exceptionally important, really on a national level. The Gervase Wheeler is an Italianate house, and the gatehouse is Gothic Revival, is the same style as this house. So there was what happens normally is, the Starchitects and the national figures introduce something, and then it's simplified and it gets digested down. and there was a strong attention to landscaping in the 19th century. And, the two features that we know were original to the house are the two ancient sugar maple trees on the front lawn. And also the walnut is probably, based on its size, I would guess it was probably planted about the time the house was built because of its enormous size. But I know on East Avenue, before the city had a tree program, all of the property owners on East Avenue planted horse chestnut trees before the elms along East Avenue and maintained them. And in this village, that's one of the reasons why villages were formed early in the 19th century, is because one of the things the village did, just like it's supposed to do today, is maintain the street trees, so that canopy effect, which is so important. So when I was mayor, that's why I religiously tried to put every tree back, because it slows cars, and it's one of the reasons why the village is so beautiful. And it was true 100 years ago the same way it is today, and we know that from photographs.
There was a question over here.
Yes.
I was just wondering, just from historical, we just recently drove to the northern part of New Hampshire, going through Vermont. Mm-hmm. And as I'm going through Vermont, all of a sudden I come across the town of Mendon.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in about a quarter of a mile, there's a sign for Pittsford there.
And Rochester is not far away, right?
Is that where this is from?
Yes. Colonel Caleb Hopkins. Pittsford was called Smallwood, then Boyle. Fortunately, they changed the name. When he retired, well, Northfield was the first name. Northfield, Smallwood, Boyle, Pittsford. Pittsford was chosen because Colonel Caleb Hopkins fought in the War of 1812. He was a distinguished general, and he was also town supervisor, and they wanted to recognize that by naming the town after his birthplace, Pittsford, Vermont. And Pittsford, Michigan is named after, there's 3 Pittsfords in New York, or in the United States, Pittsford, Michigan. There's also Pittsford, Vermont is named for Pittsford, England, which only has 1 T instead of 2 T's. Yeah.
We also have a descendant of Caleb Hopkins here in this room.
David Peck, our new member.
You spoke of the New England origin of the first settlers. Is there any known explanation as to why we do not have a New England village green?
We did have a New England green. In fact, the Woman's Temperance Fountain, where the base is still in the Phoenix building, was located along with a watering trough in the green, which was originally State Street split in a V, and a wing of it came up in front of the Phoenix Hotel, and there was a green in the middle with a water trough and the drinking fountain. And then in the 1920s, as the DOT tends to do even today, they improved the road and got rid of the green. And then the other thing that happened there is that because that porch that I talked about with the Phoenix Hotel in the 1920s and the 1930s is with cars, community hotels died. It was one of those things that happened very quickly. And then most of the hotels, if it didn't become a bar, it became apartments or a house or something. And so the Phoenix Hotel, they enclosed the porch, and for a while it was a restaurant, and then it was like a Bavarian lodge or something, and different things. And then, it sort of started to get run down. They took the chimneys off, and they painted it white. The shutters were gone. It wasn't looking so good. And then in the 50s, they ripped the porch off, and they built a gas station on the front of it, and that destroyed what was left of the green. And fortunately, Andy Wolf, he purchased the, none of that never should have happened, because the gas station was actually, most of it was on property that was actually village property, but that was a different era. In any case, Andy Wolf had the foresight to buy the hotel. And then when he had the opportunity, he bought the gas station, tore it down. He actually found because there were photographs of what that beautiful entrance looked like. He found, I don't know how he did this, but he found a relic from another building that actually fit. And it looks almost identical to what was there beforehand. And, if anybody deserves credit for changing the direction of this town, it's Andy Wolf,
Well, there's a book going around right now. A lot of you know architecture worth saving? And he published that for Historic Pittsford, and we have a ton of those books still available. But there, you know, this house, of course, is in that book,
And one of the other things he did for decades, because he owned the Brighton Pittsford Post in an era when people read weekly community newspapers, is almost every week, or at the minimum once a month, there was a good story on history, preservation, or the importance of sound planning. And so he really educated the community in a way that's not possible today, to explain to them that you have something precious here, and if you do stupid things, you're going to lose it all. And, you know, I look at some of the recent things that have happened over the last few years here, and it's something that we're still trying to figure out at Historic Pittsford as an organization, is how can we convey that to the new people who come here. And, you know, what we've heard a lot from the younger families is, you know, they just think it's always been this way, and they take it for granted. What they don't realize is it's only this way because a few people have done, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, stuck their neck out to do what's right and speak out against bad ideas, development projects that would destroy qualities that really are integral to the character and the history of the community. And so, you know, that's something that, you know, it's a changing target, and it's something we've talked a lot about on the board of directors for Historic Pittsford. So.
That decorative doorway you referred to on the Phoenix building was originally on a mansion at Cornhill called the Third Ward.
Oh, so you know where it came from?
Yeah, and that house was being torn down. In fact, James A. McNeil Whistler saw it, and he declared it the most beautiful doorway he'd ever seen. And it was stored in the barn out of the Stone Tolan house on East Avenue, and that's where it was when Andy Wolf spotted that and made the connection.
Thank you, Douglas. For those of you that don't know, Douglas and I are relatives. He is the son of Sheldon Fisher. Sheldon Fisher, who was, of course, the great historian who owned Valentine Museum in Victor, and Douglas himself has had a lifelong interest in history. There is one other tidbit of Pittsford history that I discovered this year from Cynthia House, that I never knew before, but it's kind of interesting. It's similar to the story about the doorway. When Village Hall, where my grandmother was born, my great-grandparents lived, when Mary Emily Wiltsey Field purchased that, she took the living room from her father's house in Cornhill, because he was a well-known attorney who founded the Rochester Public Library System, and she took all the woodwork, and that beautiful meeting room in Village Hall is actually the interior of.
Water?
I sure do. Is the interior of his house in Cornhill. I never knew which house. I thought the house had been demolished, but it wasn't. If you go on Plymouth Avenue and you drive past the jail, everybody know where the jail is downtown? And you go over the expressway, the first house on the right, that big Victorian one with a tower, that was her father's house. So after she took, not only, you know, she spent the equivalent of $4 million renovating my great-grandparents' house for the library and community center with her father's stained glass and woodwork. Then his old house, she didn't just abandon it. She redid the whole thing beautifully, actually, and then she donated it to the Red Cross, and that was the headquarters for the Red Cross in 1937 after this project was completed. So she was, you know, just one of those great people who did wonderful things. And
what's your name again?
Mary Emily Wiltsey Field. And her father was Charles Wiltsey Field. And he had lived in the house because his parents were renovating their house, which is no longer here. It's where the bank is today. And they rented that house, and so he was born there, and that's why she ended up giving it to the village. But he was from, the Wiltsey and the Crumps had the general store at the Four Corners. The Crumps founded that store. The Wiltseys had a forwarding house on the canal, but as the forwarding business went kaput because of the railroads, the Wiltseys and the Crumps combined, they tore down the original store, built the Opera House, which burned, And then they built the current building, and because Pittsford needed an opera house or a performance hall, that's why Town Hall was built in 1890. So it's all related.
And people may have wondered about the appropriate woodwork on the interior of the Phoenix building. And there was an early 19th century tavern in the town of Brighton at the southwest corner of South Clinton and West Falls. And some doctors had bought that and wanted to tear that down, which they did, to build a medical office. And they donated all of the woodwork from that 1820s tavern to Andy Wolf.
Wow.
To use.
I did not know that. See, I'm learning stuff today. That's awesome. The other thing, just to give you a sense of Andy Wolf's passion for it, when he renovated the Phoenix building, the gas station was still there, so he couldn't use the front entrance. So he built the new entrance that faces Main Street, which also has a very nice doorway, that was new. He built that. And if you go in that doorway, there's a beautiful staircase that I don't know where he found that, but it's lovely. And if you ever get a chance, you have to wind around, because originally you went in the front door and there was a staircase up to the second floor and went up to the third floor to the ballroom. But if you ever get a chance, go to the third floor ballroom, because it spans across the full length of the building, and it has a cove ceiling. And originally it had a spring floor, which is a special type of 19th century construction that when they had a dance, the floor could bounce and it wouldn't hurt the building. Yes, Carol.
The fireplace and everything is still in place on the third floor, but it's hazardous to have a lot of people up there because of, fire escapes.
Right.
So why it isn't open to the public. The spring house, talking about the spring floor, and that was for the early settlers who came from Vermont on the canal, that was where they disembarked, was at the spring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right. And, which also had a spring floor. The only other building I know that's left in Monroe County that has a spring floor is the Culver Tavern, which is on East Boulevard in the city of Rochester. And that has it has a room that spans the full length of the second floor. It's very similar to the ballroom in the Phoenix Hotel. It also has a cove plaster ceiling, just like the Phoenix Hotel does. All right, well, thank you, everybody.